Alrighty, hi guys, it's Jubilee again. I'm back for another TA review. This week we are going over material for quiz 7. That's going to be endocrine and eye. I know you guys did just have your midterm, so hopefully that went well for everybody. Hopefully you guys realized kind of what we're asking for you from that, and that we do need you to study. We do want you to learn. And so, try to take this material seriously for your final. If it does make you feel better, all of the material from quizzes 1 through 6 will not be on your final. It will be starting from this quiz, from quiz 7. Okay? So yeah, hopefully that went well for you guys, and hopefully you realize how important the extra credit is in this course, and that is why we give you a lot of it. Okay? Alrighty, so we'll go ahead and get started on endocrine and eye. So we'll start with endocrine. And so the function of the endocrine system, here's the big broad definition, the collection of glands that produce hormones that regulate metabolism, growth, development, tissue function, sexual function, reproduction, sleep, and mood, among other things, right? So basically what that means is the endocrine system is a whole bunch of glands, right? They produce hormones. Those hormones are going to be put into your blood, right? That's the whole way that endocrine cells work. So they produce it into the blood, and it travels hematogenously, like through the blood, to control other cells. Okay, so basically the production of hormones to control stuff, right? A lot of stuff. So your endocrine system is a big regulator of your daily metabolic things, growth, function, everything like that. All right. And so when we think about the endocrine system, the big gland that we're talking about is going to be the pituitary. Okay, so you have a bunch of other different little glands all throughout your body, right? But the pituitary is kind of like the gland of all glands. Okay, so it is the gland that controls other glands as well. Okay, and so it consists of these 3 different parts that we're going to need you guys to learn. So there's the pars distalis, so that's going to be this one right here. This is the pars distalis. That's going to consist of these 2 main cell types that we need you guys to know, acetophils and basophils. Okay, acetophils and basophils. And the way I remember that is acetophils, they're acid loving. Right, they're acid loving, so they're going to stain that very acid like color. So in an H&E stain, they're going to stain very red. They're going to pick up that eosin. Okay, they're very acid loving. And they produce hormones that mainly have to do with growth and development. So this is this whole big chart, and you guys can use it absolutely for your quizzes, but I will need you guys to memorize it for your final, right? Because that's going to be closed note. So you don't have to memorize it right now, but it would be helpful because you'll still need it for your final. So your acetophils, these red ones right here, are going to be responsible for hormones that have to do with growth and development, or at least that's how I remember it. So mainly growth hormone. Right, growth hormone is going to have an effect on many different types of tissues, right? Your muscle, your adipose tissue, your bone. It's going to tell you how to regulate your metabolism, how to grow, everything like that. And then prolactin, it doesn't really have to do with growth and development. Prolactin is what allows for milk letdown in the mammary gland, and production of milk. Oxytocin is milk letdown. Sorry, not to confuse you guys. So production of milk in the mammary gland, and that kind of has to do with growth and development, the way I think of it, because you're making milk and babies need that to grow. Okay, the next one is going to be basophils. This is all still in the pars distalis. So the basophils are going to produce hormones that control other hormone producing glands. Okay, so kind of how I remember that's the one that does that is basophils are like the base of all the other glands, right? So it's going to produce ACTH. That means adrenal corticotrophic hormone. So it's going to stimulate the adrenal cortex, right? That's another endocrine gland. It produces thyroid stimulating hormone. That's going to stimulate the thymus, yet another endocrine gland, right? It's going to produce follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH, and those are going to have effects on the gonads, so the testes and the ovary, yet another endocrine gland, right? So basophils are kind of like the base of the endocrine system. They control a lot of the other endocrine glands in your system. Okay, and then you have the pars intermedia. We'll see that in a second. I don't need you guys to know any of the hormones that it produces. You can mainly just think of it as connective tissue that contains a lot of vessels connecting these two together and supplying them with a lot of big blood vessels. Okay, and then we have the pars nervosa over here. The pars nervosa is going to contain a lot of nervous tissue. That's why it's called the pars nervosa. And within the pars nervosa, we have these herring bodies, these little portions of the nervous tissue that's going to be storing oxytocin and ADH. Okay, those hormones are made in the hypothalamus, but they're stored and it's controlled when they release in the pars nervosa. And so oxytocin, that has a lot to do with the whole birth-giving process, parturition. So it's going to cause uterine contraction, as well as milk letdown. So that's what I messed up earlier. Oxytocin is milk letdown. Prolactin is the actual production of milk. So milk letdown just means like actual moving of the milk from the ducts to the actual teat itself. And then ADH. So ADH is antidiuretic hormone. And so that has an effect on the kidney, and basically the way I think of it is it's what allows you to concentrate your urine. Okay, antidiuretic hormone. And another way I remember that is antidiuretic hormone is kind of the opposite of a diuretic, right? And alcohol is actually a diuretic, okay? So it makes it hard for you to concentrate your urine. That's why whenever you drink a bunch of alcohol, you have to go to the bathroom a lot because you can't concentrate your urine, so you're basically excreting out or secreting out water. Alrighty, let's see. So here is a histological view of the pituitary gland. And so here you can see these three distinct different sections, right? So we've got this one right here with a bunch of blue and red. We've got this one in the middle, and then this one right here. And so those are going to be the three different sections. So this is going to be the pars distalis right here with a bunch of blue and red, and that's where we're going to have our acetophils, the very red staining ones, and the basophils, the very blue staining ones. Right here in between, so that's going to be our pars intermedia. And it does secrete some hormones, but we don't need you guys to worry about that. You can think of it as the connective tissue and vessels kind of binding these two together. And then we've got the pars nervosa. So the pars nervosa has a bunch of nervous tissue, right? And it looks like it, and we'll see close-ups of those as well, right? And then you've got your infundibular stalk. That's what kind of connects the pituitary gland up to the brain above it. Because so the pituitary gland is kind of like an extension of the brain, but it does not have the blood-brain barrier, so it kind of dips down so it can sample everything that's going on in the blood, because it does want to know what's going on in the blood so that it can regulate it, right? So that it can respond appropriately. It wants to get feedback from all of the other endocrine glands in your body, see what's going on with those hormones so it can decide, oh, we need more of this hormone, or oh, we need less. Okay, so that's why it kind of dips down from your brain. You can see it right there, this kind of little nub dipping down from your brain, so it can sample the blood. Alrighty, so here is the pars nervosa, and so remember we said that is a lot of nervous tissue, and so it is these kind of axons going down, and then we've got these little pockets forming within those where we're storing those hormones, the ADH and the oxytocin. And so that's going to be found in what's called a herring body. So they look like these kind of little like thumbprint smudges or something, these kind of larger areas kind of ballooning out. Those are going to be our herring bodies right there. Maybe there's one that we can imagine right there. Those are going to be our herring bodies storing that oxytocin and ADH. Okay, and then we've also got pituocytes in there. That's just the general cell of the pituitary gland of the pars nervosa. Okay, so a bunch of pituocytes in there as well. Okay, so here's more of the pars nervosa. So you can see these really big kind of swollen smudges in here. Those are going to be those herring bodies. And then you've kind of got other cells and pituocytes all throughout. Okay, and remember that's oxytocin that it's making, so uterine contraction, milk letdown, so milk ejection, and then ADH, antidiuretic hormone, that's for water absorption. And what I mean by water absorption is reabsorption back into the body, right? So it allows you to concentrate your urine so you can save that water in your body. All right, so now we're looking at the pars distalis, and so that has mainly acetophils, basophils, and chromophobes. So the acetophils, that's what we talked about, the acid-loving cells, so they're going to stain more red. So that's all of these. So this is a section of the pars distalis with a lot of acetophils. Here's more acetophils in this stain right here, right? Bunch of acetophils. And remember, those are going to be the ones that have to do with growth. So your growth hormone and your prolactin. Your basophils are going to be the more blue staining basic ones. So that's right here, right? A bunch of basophils that we see. And remember, those are going to be the ones that control a lot of the other endocrine glands, right? So your ACTH, your FSH, your TSH, all the hormones that stimulate other glands to make their hormones, okay? And then you've got your chromophobes. So chromophobes, we actually don't know what they do. We just know that they're there, and so we just named it not based off of their function, but based off of how they stain, just like we did with the acetophils and basophils. So the chromophobes, it's called that because it basically means like afraid of color, right? They don't like color, so they actually don't pick up any stain, or they don't like to pick up stains. So this would be a chromophobe right here. You can see that the cytoplasm of the cell isn't really picking up any stain, right? You can really only see the nucleus. So here would be another chromophobe. They don't like to pick up stain, okay? And so you don't need to know, if it's in a multiple choice question, that's my hint to you. And he says, what hormones being produced match the cell. If he matches any hormone to a chromophobe, you know it's wrong because they don't produce any hormones as far as we need to know. Okay, so that's our chromophobes. All right, so here's more of the pars distalis right here showing you everything that they make, right? So we've got our acetophils making prolactin and growth hormone, and then we've got our basophils making all of these hormones that stimulate other endocrine glands, right? So ACTH, TSH, FSH, LH. And then here you can see, right, so these very bright red ones are going to be our acetophils. This is in a portion with a lot of acetophils in it, so a lot of these are going to be our acetophils, these very bright red staining, big bubbly cells. And then we've got a couple of basophils in here as well, and then some chromophobes that don't like to stain. All right, so that's it with the pituitary gland. Yeah, that's all I'll tell you. So it's basically just the master gland, right? It influences a lot of different tissues, a lot of different glands, and the way it does that is it gets this whole kind of negative feedback loop, right? So all of these other glands are going to produce a hormone to send back to the pituitary gland, and it's this whole kind of negative feedback system, right? So if I am the pituitary gland and I want the thyroid gland to work harder, I'm going to produce this TSH, this thyroid stimulating hormone, right? This thyroid is going to work harder and produce what it produces, and then that's going to feed back into the blood so that the pituitary can pick it up, right? The pituitary will sense the thyroid glands, the hormones that it's making in the blood, and it'll say, okay, it's doing a good job of that. I don't need any more of that thyroid hormone, so I'm going to produce less TSH. Okay, so this whole kind of negative feedback loop, that's how they talk to each other, and they say, hey, are you doing your job? And they'll send back their hormone and say, yes, I am, here you go. Okay, so that's kind of what the pituitary gland does, is it controls all the other glands. It's kind of like the big coordinator. Okay, so now we've got the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland is a big regulator of metabolism. Okay, so if you are skinnier than you'd like to be, blame your thyroid gland. If you are heavier than you'd like to be, blame your thyroid gland. Okay, that's what I'm gonna say. There's a lot of other things that influence it, but yeah, you can blame your thyroid gland if you'd like. All right, so thyroid gland, it is controlled by TSH, right? That's from the pituitary. That's thyroid stimulating hormone. So when it has more TSH in the blood, it stimulates the thyroid gland to produce more of its hormone, okay? And so in the thyroid gland, you've got all of these kind of follicles, right? You see how there's all these little big big circles, right? Those are all follicles within the thyroid gland. And so around the follicles, you're going to have these cells called follicular cells of the thyroid gland. Okay, so these are all follicular cells around here surrounding this follicle. And what they're producing is colloids. So this pink stuff in the middle, that's the colloid that they're producing and storing here. They're storing it in this follicle, and that's a precursor to thyroglobulin. Okay, so that's a precursor to those thyroid hormones, T3, T4, and those are the big regulators of metabolism. Okay, so your heart rate, how much calories you burn in a day, your underlying basal metabolism, your thyroid gland has a lot to do with that, and that's those follicular cells and that colloid doing that. Okay. And then you also have these parafollicular cells. So parafollicular means by the follicle, right? Or next to or beside the follicle. So here we've got all our follicular cells, right? Neatly lining the follicle. And you can see how there are these cells in between that. These bubbly cells in between these follicular cells. These are going to be your parafollicular cells, okay? And these have a kind of different function. So what they're going to do is produce calcitonin. And the way I remember what calcitonin does is I remember it by the fact that it tones down calcium. Okay, calcitonin tones down the amount of calcium you'll have in your blood. Okay, so it regulates that. And the way it regulates that is it inhibits osteoclast activity. And remember, we said osteoclasts catalyze bone. They break down bone, right? So when they're breaking down bone, they're releasing all the calcium in the bone, right? So if we inhibit those osteoclasts, we say, hey, stop breaking down that bone, guys, tone it down. That's going to reduce the amount of free calcium in the blood. Okay, so that's what those parafollicular cells are doing with that calcitonin. So that was the thyroid gland, and then on the thyroid gland, there's this tiny little baby gland called the parathyroid gland, right? So that's that same base term, right next to or beside the thyroid. So the parathyroid gland has what we call chief cells and oxyphils, okay? So the chief cells are going to be the ones actually producing the hormones, so that's all of these kind of darker ones right here. All of these bubbly looking cells are the chief cells, and then these kind of brighter pink ones right here are going to be the oxyphils, okay? And so the chief cells are going to be what are producing the parathyroid hormone, so PTH, parathyroid hormone. What that does is it stimulates osteoclast production, okay? And so if you remember, we just went over calcitonin that inhibits osteoclasts. Parathyroid hormone stimulates osteoclasts. So you see how they kind of work in opposites, right? PTH, parathyroid hormone, and calcitonin work in opposites. So calcitonin is going to tone down that calcium. Parathyroid hormone, by stimulating more osteoclasts and saying, hey guys, you need to get to work, you need to break down more bone, that's going to release more calcium into the blood and increase blood calcium levels. Okay, so that's parathyroid hormone. And then the oxyphils, that's another, there's a lot of cells that we don't really know what they do. So the oxyphils are another cell type that we don't really know what they do. They're named oxyphils because the only thing we know about them is they really like to be by blood vessels. Okay, they really like to be by all of these blood vessels in here. So we say they love oxygen. That's what oxyphil means, is oxygen loving. So that's all you really need to know about these oxyphils. Okay. So now we're going to do the adrenal gland, and remember the hormone produced by the adrenal gland, or by the pituitary gland that's going to stimulate the adrenal gland is ACTH, right? Adrenocorticotropic hormone. And so basically what that means is that hormone stimulates the adrenal cortex, right? Remember seeing that in the diagram? Only the adrenal cortex. So there's also the adrenal medulla. That's something that we're not really going to talk about as much, so it's more in the middle. I will tell you though, the adrenal medulla is what's going to make your epinephrine. Okay, your epinephrine. So that's your fight or flight, your go now, you're super excited. That is not controlled by the endocrine system, right? That's more of a conscious response, right? So if you get excited, it doesn't need to wait on your pituitary gland to do that. It'll just release that epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. Okay, so that's your adrenal medulla, and that's why we're not going to talk about it as much, because it's less of an endocrine thing, and as far as, the pituitary gland and all of that goes, okay? So this is going to be the break off of your adrenal medulla. So this is all medulla. That's where you have your epinephrine, norepinephrine release. Up here is going to be the adrenal cortex. And remember, that is what's stimulated by ACTH from the pituitary gland. Okay, and it can get kind of complicated. So there's three main zones in the adrenal cortex, and you can just kind of see how they kind of look different, right? As the cells start to transition from these bubbly cells to these ones with multiple bubbles within each cell, to these kind of fatter, more pink cells. You can just kind of broadly break down the zones of these three, okay? So the zone closest to the capsule, to the outside of the adrenal gland, is going to be the zona glomerulosa. And what that's going to do is make mineralocorticoids. Okay, a good example of the important mineralocorticoid in the zona glomerulosa is aldosterone. Okay, and aldosterone is a big hormone that impacts the kidneys. It's, what we learn in vet school is aldosterone saves sodium and pees potassium. And that's how I learn it, and I repeat it to myself all the time. Save sodium and pees potassium, because that's really important to your fluid and your electrolyte balance. Okay, so that's what aldosterone is there for. It impacts the kidneys and tells them the electrolytes they need to save and keep within the body and the ones that they need to excrete out and get rid of. All right, so next is going to be the zona fasciculata. And that's going to make glucocorticoids like cortisol. Okay, cortisol. And cortisol is your big, stereotypical stress hormone. Whenever you have a bunch of stress, you make a bunch of cortisol. So it does things like increases your heart rate, increases your blood pressure. It tells your liver to start making glucose because you're probably going to need it because you're doing something exciting and stressful. So that's cortisol and those glucocorticoids in the zona fasciculata. And then we've got the zona reticularis. That's what's going to make your androgens. And the way I think of androgens is they're kind of like sex hormones, okay? So it's not the same as testosterone and estrogen, but they do play a role in like secondary sex characteristics and stuff like that, especially for the male. Okay, so that's where your androgens are made. So that's how you can remember it. It's zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis within the adrenal cortex. Okay, next is going to be the pancreas, and we will cover more of the pancreas whenever we cover the digestive system, but the pancreas has exocrine and endocrine functions. Okay, so right now we're covering the endocrine system, so that's what we're going to focus on, but it also has exocrine functions that have to do with the digestive system. Okay, so the exocrine functions is to make things like bile acid, digestive enzymes, not bile acid, but digestive enzymes to go into your digestive system to help that. But then it also has endocrine functions to help control your glucose in your blood. Okay, so these kind of little lighter staining islands that we have in here, this lighter staining island amongst all of these cells, that's what we're going to call an islet of Langerhans. Okay, so basically means island of the guy that discovered them, Langerhans. So islets of Langerhans, here is this as well in the toluidine blue staining. So these are all the cells around it. These are the islets. And so what that does is it has alpha and beta cells within it, and those are little endocrine cells, and they're going to make insulin and glucagon. Okay, so those are really big in regulating your blood glucose levels. So insulin, the way I remember it, is that's going to be present in the fed state, right? So you just ate a big meal, you just ate a donut or something, and you have all that sugar coming from your digestive system into your blood, right? And we don't want all that sugar to stay in your blood. That's kind of bad for your body to always have sugar in your blood. So the insulin is going to allow the cells in your body to absorb the glucose from your blood, okay? So they get fed when you get fed, and that's kind of what insulin does, okay? And then glucagon is the opposite. So they're always working against each other. So glucagon is present in the fasted state. So if you haven't eaten a donut in forever, right, you're kind of low on your blood sugar, We don't want your blood sugar to always be high, but we don't want it to be zero, right? Because you still need glucose, you still need energy just to function, right? So when you're super hungry and stuff like that, what glucagon is going to do is it's going to stimulate production and mobilization of glucose into the blood. So it's going to raise those blood glucose levels just so that your cells can get enough to get by, okay? To raise it so that it's not zero or something definitely low. Okay, so they're kind of working in opposites all the time, and that's the endocrine part of your pancreas. All right, so now we've got the testes. So those are an endocrine gland as well, and we'll learn more about it when we learn about the testes, but just do know, they produce testosterone, so that's big for sperm production as well as secondary male sex characteristics, and so they'll be found in these cells right here. We'll learn a lot more about all of this. These are the seminiferous tubules. We'll learn that when we learn about the male. But in between those big tubules, you've got these kind of bubbly cells. These are the lytic cells, right? So in between these big tubules, you've got these lytic cells. And those are those endocrine cells that are going to produce testosterone, okay, to go throughout the body to help with sperm production and to help with those secondary sex characteristics. All right. And then the female counterpart is going to be the ovary. So that's another endocrine gland, right? They produce ovum and everything like that, right? The eggs, everything like that. But what they also do is produce the female sex hormones. So that's going to be estrogen and progesterone, and that's going to be in the follicles that they're producing that. So you've got a bunch of follicles within the ovary, always at different stages, doing their own little thing, producing a bunch of estrogen and progesterone. Okay, and that's going to help regulate the female reproductive cycle as well as their secondary sex characteristics. All right, so this is kind of the last little bit I want to talk to you guys about within the endocrine system, just because it is a really important concept and it is also a bit of a confusing one, okay? And, even if you don't understand it in this course and you get by, I promise, if you're a pre-professional student like I was, it'll come back up again and again and again because it is very important. So this is talking about a portal system. And you have a bunch of portal systems throughout your body. Specifically, we're going to talk about some of the ones in the endocrine system, and I need you guys to understand how a portal system works, okay? So it is talking about blood supply and how blood circulates through the body. So what I will tell you is normally the way that blood circulates throughout the body, right, is it pumps out the heart, it goes through an artery, arterial, capillary. Capillary is where it exchanges everything, right? So it exchanges everything it needs to, then it goes back to a venule, a vein, back to the heart, right? So that's normally how it works, is it goes through the heart, goes to a capillary bed, one capillary bed, goes back to the heart to another capillary bed, back to the heart to another capillary bed, right? But in the endocrine system, sometimes what happens is we have a portal system, and that's where the same blood goes through two capillary beds before it goes back to the heart. Okay, so it goes through a first capillary bed, and then instead of going straight back to the heart, it goes through a portal vein or a portal artery to a secondary capillary bed. Okay, and that's an important difference, and the reason that's so important is the function of that, right? Because normally when you go through that first capillary bed, that's where you exchange all your nutrients and your oxygen, right? And then it needs to go back to the heart because it already exchanged all of that, right? It needs to get more oxygen back from the lungs, right? It needs to get more oxygen and get rid of that waste and everything like that, right? But what happens is in that first capillary bed where it goes to that first set of tissues, those first set of tissues drop something off or pick something up. They make some kind of change in the blood, and then they go through the portal vein or portal artery, and then by the time it gets to the secondary capillary bed, those cells are going to pick up whatever these first cells dropped off. Okay, and so the reason they do that is because if I was trying to send a message to some other tissues, right, and I only wanted to send it to them, it would make sense for me to just send it to them, right, to send it from here through a portal vein or artery just to them, so only these cells can pick it up, right? as opposed to how blood normally works, where we drop it off in this capillary bed, it goes all the way back to the heart, to the lungs, right? And then it goes out throughout the body. So then that blood goes to everybody instead of just these guys I want to talk to over here. Okay, so it's kind of like the difference between yelling a message that you have to one person in a room and just saying, hey, I only want to talk to this one specific person, but I'm going to yell it throughout the room, or just passing them a note so that only that person can read it. Okay, so that's what we're doing in a portal system, is we're just passing just these people a note. We just want them to pick up the message, and we want them to pick it up first in the blood. So that's what happens. So the two we're going to learn about, so the first one is a venous portal example, and that's the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, the pars distalis. So it's the hypothalamic pituitary axis or whatever. But it basically means first the hypothalamus is going to drop off blood in its capillary bed. And then instead of going right back to the heart and the lungs, it's going to go through a portal vein and then drop that message off in the secondary capillary bed in the pars distalis, right? So it's sending them a message. It's dropping off little hormones, neurotransmitters, whatever, and then it's distributing them just to these cells right here, okay? The other example we're going to learn about is in the pancreas, between the islets of Langerhans, right? Remember, that's our insulin glucagon cells, and the acinar cells within the pancreas, okay? So here's our islet of Langerhans, and here we're going to make our insulin glucagon, and then it's going to be dropped off in that first capillary, go through a portal artery, and then be dropped off in this capillary bed to tell these guys, hey, we are either in the fed state, so we need to produce digestive enzymes to break down that glucose in our digestive system, or hey, we are in the fasted state, so we need to not produce digestive enzymes, okay? So it's more of a direct message between these two tissues, okay? Because they're so close together, right? They're so close together, they're just cells apart. It would not make sense to drop this message off in the blood, take it all the way back to the heart and the lungs, and then back to here. Right? So we're just sending it through this tiny portal artery or portal vein so that we can send a more direct message, okay? So hopefully that was clear to you guys, but that's basically what a portal system is. Okay, so now we're going to go over the eye. It is a little more straightforward, and students do tend to like it because it's something you can really visualize, no pun intended, and really make sense of, okay? So this is the eye. This is like a cross section of the eye. If I cut, flat to the screen through the eye and we're looking at it. And so, this is the way light is going into the eye. And so cellular structures that the light is going to pass through, right? So first it's going to pass through the cornea. Then it's going to pass through the lens. And finally, it's going to pass through the retina in the back of your eye. Okay, it passes through the retina. And that is how light goes through your eye to eventually get to your optic nerve, that big nerve that's going to transmit it to your brain. Okay, so it has to go through all three of these structures. Light is going to bend and refract as it goes through these and everything to help focus that image so that it focuses perfectly on your retina. Okay, other structures that light doesn't pass through but still influence the image are going to be the iris of your eye. So the iris is kind of like the shutter, right? It's the colored part of your eye. That's the part that's going to get bigger and smaller to allow more light in or less light, okay? So that's that colored circle in your eye. The ciliary bodies. So the ciliary bodies are out here. We'll talk more about them. But what that's going to do is change the shape of the lens. As well as produce fluid to keep the eye inflated. And that helps focus the image as well. And then the trabecular meshwork, we'll learn more about that. But that's right in there, and that's what's going to allow the fluid being made by the part of the ciliary body to drain so that, the eye doesn't blow up into a big ball and explode. Okay? So the eye is very much like a camera, like the old-fashioned kind of camera. So I'm sure this analogy was very useful when people knew how cameras worked, but it's probably a little less helpful now. But, if you learned in physics and all of that how light refracts and everything and focuses on the image, that's what your eye's trying to do. So it's trying to take all of these, light rays from outside and focus them perfectly right on your retina, right? So if it focuses it too early or too late, the image will be really blurry, okay? And so it has three main layers. So the supporting layer is going to consist of the cornea and the sclera. Okay, the cornea and the sclera. So that's what provides support and structure to your eye. Within that is going to be the vascular layer. So that contains the iris, the ciliary body, the choroid, the ciliary processes. And that is going to have a bunch of all of your blood vessels. Okay, so it's going to be highly vascular, and it's going to provide nutrients and everything to the other layers. Okay, the innermost layer is going to be the retinal layer. So that's the functional layer. The retina of your eye, so that's that innermost layer, that's the part that's going to connect to the optic nerve and go into your brain and tell you what you're seeing, right? So that's the functional layer that actually, sees things or picks up on those light signals. Okay, so this is kind of a hefty slide, but we're going to go over the important structures of the eye. So first is the cornea, right? Remember we said that's one of the structures that light has to pass through to get to the retina. So this is the clear part of your eye, okay? So if you look at your eye from the side, it is very clear, right? And that makes sense because light does have to pass through it to get to your retina. So that's the part in front of your iris, right? The colored part of your eye, and your pupil. Your pupil is the black part of your eye, and it's only black because there's nothing there. There's the lens behind it, but the pupil is the gap in your iris, okay? And the reason it's black is because all the light is entering your eye and sinking down in there. So there's no light coming out of your pupil back out, right? So it looks black. So that's your cornea right there. That's the clear part at the very front of your eye. And then another thing about it is avascular. And that's what helps it be clear. Okay, so we have a very regular structure of connective tissue right here, and so if we put a bunch of blood vessels through here, your cornea would not be perfectly clear. Okay, so it doesn't have any blood vessels. It has to get its nutrients from the surrounding tissue and the fluid within here. Okay, and then and then the next part is going to be your sclera. That's going to be the whites of your eyes, right? So outside of your cornea, outside of your iris, the colored part of your eye, the whites of your eyes, that's a bunch of that connective tissue that's continuous with the cornea. It's just not clear because it's not as regularly lined, and it is vascular. Okay, so it does have a bunch of blood vessels within it as well. The next part is going to be the aqueous humor. So your eye is filled with fluid, and the aqueous humor is going to be in front of the lens. So this is the lens, in front of the lens, and that's that clear fluid that kind of inflates your eye like a basketball, okay, to keep this cornea the right shape that it needs to be. Okay, and this fluid's constantly being produced and let out, and produced and let out, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Okay, so it's found in the anterior chamber. The anterior chamber is in front of the iris, and the posterior chamber is behind the iris. So it's found in both of those. Okay, and it constantly has to be recycled from the posterior to the anterior chamber. Okay, and all of that's in front of the lens. Okay. The next one is your iris. So your iris is right here. That is also connective tissue, and it does have a lot of blood vessels as well. So this is part of the vascular layer. This is also the colored part of your eye, and that is why it is colored, is because it kind of acts as a shutter. Okay, a shutter, so it decides how much light to let into your eye and how much to not. So this iris will actually contract or dilate to allow more light or less light into your eyes, right? Because sometimes you're in a very dark place and you need as much light to go into your eye as possible for you to see anything. And sometimes you're in a very bright place, right? Like if you're staring at the sun, it's going to contract as much as possible because it doesn't want to blind you and damage the back of your eye, the retina. Okay. Let's see. And then there's the lens. So the lens is this big, dense looking thing in here. This is the part of your eye that can actually adjust, so it will change shape, and that's what's going to focus the image. onto your retina. Okay, so the cornea helps to refract a lot of the light onto the retina, but the lens is what's going to change the focus, right? So that's the difference between looking far away and looking close up. Your your lens actually changes shape to change the focus. Okay, the next thing is going to be the ciliary body. So this is the ciliary body. It's made up of two things, the ciliary muscle and the ciliary processes. So the ciliary muscle is what's going to be attached to these things called zonules. So these little strings that attach to the lens, and the ciliary muscle is smooth muscle that's going to contract and change the shape of the lens. So that's what helps the lens change shape, is the ciliary muscle. Okay. And then the ciliary processes are these little processes that project off, and that's what's making the fluid in the anterior and posterior chambers, so the aqueous humor. Okay, and again, that helps maintain the shape of this part of the eye. The next thing is the vitreous humor. So vitreous humor is going to be back here in the vitreous body in the back of the eye, and that's what makes up about 90% of the volume of your eye. Okay, and so light does have to pass through that as well, and it's very thick. It's very vitreous or mucousy and thick. Okay, the aqueous humor is a lot more aqueous, a lot more watery. Okay. So we'll go over these in a little more detail. So now we're looking at the cornea. If we zoom in on the cornea, so this is kind of the edge of the cornea, but remember this is that clear part of the eye that light does have to pass through. And so it's got these different layers, and so the outermost one, so this is the outside of the eye where the light's coming from and then passing through the cornea. The outside, remember, this part of your eye is open to friction, right? Every time you blink your eye, there's friction. So that's why we're going to have stratified squamous epithelium. Stratified squamous epithelium, okay? Because we do have friction here, and anytime we have a place where there's a lot of friction, we need stratified squamous epithelium, okay? It is non-keratinized, meaning these cells at the top are still alive, and that's because, we have friction, but it doesn't need to be as tough as like the skin on your arm does, right? That's why your eye feels different, or one of the reasons why, okay? The next one is going to be Bowman's membrane. And so that's kind of just like the connective tissue below the stratified squamous epithelium. So right here is going to be Bowman's membrane, okay, a special kind of band of connective tissue. Here is going to be the corneal stroma. So that's where we've got most of the regular connective tissue. This is going to be, there's going to be a bunch of fibroblasts and stuff in there. And you can see how tightly arranged this is, right? And that's to make this tissue as transparent as possible, right? So light doesn't refract when it goes through it and bounce all around here. It just goes straight through, okay? Then we've got Descemet's membrane, and that's going to be this one right here. And then we've got our corneal endothelium, okay? Corneal endothelium. And so that's going to be simple squamous epithelium, right? So one layer thick of those flat cells, okay? And the way I remember the difference between Bowman's membrane and Descemet's membrane is B comes before D. The light goes through B before it goes through D, okay? So Bowman's membrane and Descemet's membrane. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some more structures. So we've still got the cornea here, right, with Bowman's membrane, Descemet's membrane, right, the stratified squamous epithelium, simple squamous endothelium. And here we've got some of these structures in the corner of this kind of junction, right? So this is that junction between the cornea and the sclera, right? The clear part and the white part of your eyes. And you can see how we've got blood vessels here, right? That's how we know this is in the sclera, because remember we said the cornea is avascular. There's no blood vessels throughout the stroma. The sclera, there are. So this is the sclera up here. And here's where we've got kind of this corner in the eye where the iris meets the rest of the eye. Okay, so that's that kind of junction. And so we've got these two different chambers, right? Remember we said the anterior chamber is going to be in front of the iris, and the posterior chamber is going to be behind the iris, right? So this is the iris right here projecting out. And so we've got the anterior chamber and the posterior chamber. These are both filled with aqueous humor. Okay, and then here we've got the ciliary body. So the ciliary body is made of that ciliary muscle. Remember, that's that muscle that attaches to the zonules, that changes the shape of the lens to allow the lens to focus. And then also part of the ciliary body are these ciliary processes. And so these have secretory cells on them, and those secretory cells right here are what's going to make that aqueous humor, okay? That very water-like fluid that inflates this part of the eye. And so it gets produced in the posterior chamber, and it has to flow behind the iris through the pupil and to the anterior chamber in front of the eye. Okay, so it has to go all the way around the iris to back up here to the anterior chamber. Okay, and so another thing that's important is the trabecular meshwork and canal of Schlemm. So the trabecular meshwork is kind of this gate right here that you see, this kind of thing of connective tissue and everything, this kind of gate, and then the canal of Schlemm are these right here, and the canals of Schlemm are what's going to allow this aqueous humor from the anterior chamber to drain out of the inside of the eye. Okay, out of inside the eye, because we said we are constantly producing this aqueous humor here, and so it needs an outlet, and so it filters through the trabecular meshwork and out the canal of Schlemm. So this helps to recycle the new aqueous humor constantly being made, and maintain the pressure and the shape of the eye. Okay, so here's a little more in depth of that kind of area, this kind of corner. So this is that iris. These are those ciliary processes that are making that aqueous humor, and it goes from the posterior chamber to the anterior chamber in front of the iris, and this is that trabecular meshwork. So it's kind of like a leaky gate. So what that trabecular meshwork does is it allows the aqueous humor to drain into the canal of Schlemm, but it doesn't allow so much to drain that it deflates the eye, right? Because if we just let it all pour out every time you put pressure on your eye or you poked your eye, right, everything would just, kind of squeeze out or ooze out of your eye, right? And then your eye would become flat, like a flat basketball, and we don't want that, right? So we want it to allow some fluid through. We don't want it to allow too much to where it flattens the shape of your eye, and we don't want it to allow so little that all of this aqueous humor builds up in the eye and the eye becomes too inflated and rigid. Okay, so we want the right pressure in the eye for it to maintain the right shape. Okay, and the trabecular meshwork helps with that. Okay, so now we're looking at the iris. Okay, the iris, remember that's that shutter, and we said it does have a lot of blood vessels. It's part of the vascular part of your eye. And we said it's the shutter, so it kind of constricts and dilates to allow more or less light in. Okay, and so it has two different kind of ways to do that. So the constrictor muscle is kind of this kind of collection of smooth muscle all through in here. This kind of denser collection of smooth muscle. So that's the constrictor muscle, and it is made of smooth muscle, and what it does is it constricts the iris, right? So it decreases the size of your pupil. And so you'd want your pupil to be smaller in places where there's lots of sun, right? We don't want too much sun going into the eye, too much light going into the eye. The dilator muscle, so the dilator muscle is going to be this little lining right here, right? That's where you can see it best. That's the lining where the dilator muscle would be, and that's made of myoepithelium. Okay, so it's not true, smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, anything like that. Myoepithelium basically means it's a type of epithelium that's able to contract. Okay, it's able to contract. So it still can contract, and that's what's going to dilate the eye. To make your pupil larger in size. Okay, and so if you think about it, you can constrict your iris a lot faster than you can dilate it, and that's because this smooth muscle is much more effective than myoepithelium is. Okay, so the dilator muscle is a little slower to act. And then down here you can see this is some of that pigmented epithelium, and that's what gives your iris the color that it has, right? And that is because the whole point of it is to be a shutter, right? So we need that pigment there to prevent the light from coming in right here, right? We only want it to go in through the pupil. So that's where that pigmented epithelium is, and that's what determines the color of your eye. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the retina. And remember, we said the retina is that photosensitive portion of the eye, right? This is the whole important part that every other part of the eye is there to support, right? Because the rest of the eye is there to bring the light right in contact with the retina, and focus it in the right way. Okay, so there's lots of layers to the retina, and we are going to learn all of them. And we'll go over them now, but I will tell you the light is coming from out here, so this is more towards the center of the eye, or the front of the eye, and it's sinking into the retina, so this is more towards the back of the eye, the bottom of the retina. Okay, so we'll start from the bottom. So this is the choroid layer right here. This is the choroid layer, and that's the vascular layer under the retina. So you can see it's got a bunch of blood vessels all throughout it. Bunch of blood vessels. So this is the vascular layer that supplies blood to the retina, because the retina is avascular. Okay, and that's because we don't want blood vessels getting in the way of all of these light beams that need to go to the retina. The next part we have is the pigmented epithelium. So this is the pigmented epithelium, and you can see this pigment right here on top of the pigmented epithelium, and that's what sinks the light into the retina, right? Because if it wasn't pigmented, and remember, white surfaces reflect light, right? They reflect light, and black surfaces will absorb light. Okay, and so this pigmented epithelium is closer to a darker color, and that's to absorb the light, so that when the light comes into the retina, it doesn't get reflected back, right? We don't want it to get reflected back, because then we get two signals to these cells, right? We get the one coming in and the one coming out, and that fuzzies up the picture. So we just want one signal going in, and we want it to sink down in the pigmented epithelium. So that's what that's there for. The next portion, so this is going to be the actual photosensitive portion. So this is the rods and cones right here. So that's the next layer. And you can see these are all the nuclei of the rods and cones. This is the actual photosensitive portion. So these are the rods and cones. And I will tell you the cones are kind of the fatter shaped ones. The fatter ones, those are going to be your cones. Okay. And then the thinner ones in between are going to be your rods. Okay. And the rods are going to be more for light and dark distinguishment. Okay, so all they'll really tell you is light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. Okay, so that's going to be important for motion. That's your black and white vision. And so all it's going to tell you, is something was light before and now it's dark, or something was dark before and now it's light. So that's really important for your peripheral vision and stuff like that. Your cones are going to tell you more detail. So they're going to tell you that there's an actual color that's present there. Okay, so some cones are there for green, some are there for blue and stuff like that. And they'll tell you, hey, there's blue right here. There's a lot of concentration of blue in this area. And so that's more detailed vision that we think of when we think of the cones. Okay, the next portion is going to be the bipolar cells, and remember, bipolar cells are cells that reach from one area and touch another, and the nucleus is in the middle. So they're communicating between the rods and cones and then the layer on top of them. Okay, so that's the bipolar cells. And then the next layer is going to be the ganglion layer. So this is the layer that connects with these bipolar cells, and it goes all the way through the retina and goes out the eye and makes up the optic nerve. And the optic nerve is what's going to transmit whatever you're seeing to your brain. Okay, so that's the ganglion layer. And then we do have special portions of the retina. And you guys do need to distinguish these from each other, because they kind of look the same, or maybe, and they're very different. So the first one is going to be the macula. The macula is the special portion where the top two layers, so the ganglion layer and the bipolar cell layer, are peeled back and pushed out of the way to expose the rods and the cones below. Okay, and so that's why you have this kind of divot, is the top two layers are being pushed out of the way, so the light directly hits those rods and cones, because that's the photosensitive portion, right? And so this is where you have the sharpest vision in your eye, the sharpest vision. So if I'm focusing on something really close, I am focusing that light coming from that object directly to my macula. Okay, and a fun fact, hawks and birds of prey and stuff like that actually have multiple maculas. So they have multiple areas where they have really sharp vision. That's why they can see really detailed from really far away, unlike us. We only have one per eye. Okay, so that's where we have the sharpest vision, and that is where we have a very high concentration of cones, because remember, those are important for detail, right? If I want to look at something and look at the detail and distinguish the colors and the nuances of something, I'm going to look at it really closely, and I'm going to focus it on my macula, okay? Another fun fact is in your periphery, so in the periphery of your retina, you have more rods, and that's because if something is in my periphery, I do not care if it is orange or green or yellow, right? I do not care. So you can trick yourself, or you can trick your friends if you put a highlighter to the very peripheral portion of your vision where you can just barely see it moving in your periphery. You actually cannot tell what color it is. Okay, so you can get your friends to do that for you, and surprise them with a different colored highlighter or pen or something. They actually cannot tell you what color that highlighter is. They can just tell you it's there. And that's because I don't care what color it is. If I cared what color it is, I would turn my head and look at it, right? Your peripheral vision is just there to tell you, oh my gosh, something's moving over there. Something's happening over there. I need to turn my head and look at it for more information. So that's where you have most of your rods, because that's just light, dark, and that tells you when something's moving, right? When there's motion going on. Okay, so that's all about that. And then we've got the blind spot. So that's a different part of your eye, and that's in the back of your eye. And that's where your optic nerve exits your eye, right? Because remember, we said the ganglion layer, all of those are little neuron parts of a neuron that connect and go through the back of the eye, make the optic nerve and go to your brain. Okay, so they need to exit somewhere. They exit through the blind spot, and this is actually where the retina is discontinuous, right? So there's no retina here. And as a result, there's no way for us to pick up light going through here. So we actually can't see things that are in our blind spot. Okay, you actually have no vision. That's very different from the macula, where you have the sharpest vision, right? So know the difference between the two. And the reason you don't see just a generic black dot where there's no vision or anything is because your brain actually works to kind of fuzzy it out. So there's other tricks to trick yourself into showing that you do have a blind spot, and y'all can look that up as well if you are interested in that. Okay, so here's this again. So this is a macula, right? So we still have the rods and cones, but the two top layers are kind of peeled and squished back. So there's this dent. That's the macula. That's where we have the sharpest vision. This right here is the blind spot, right? So this is where all those cells from the ganglion layer are connecting and going out through the optic nerve to go to the brain to tell you what you're seeing. Okay, so that's the end of that, and now we're going to do some practice. So which cell match the hormone they produce? So A, what this is pointing to is a chromophobe, right? And remember, we said we know that because it doesn't like to stain, right? You can't really see any stain picking up in the cytoplasm. You can really only see the nucleus. And remember, we said they don't really produce any hormones. So whatever it says, ADH, that is false, okay? And that one is actually, ADH is in the pars nervosa, in those herring bodies, right? B, this is pointing to an acetophil, right? And I know that because it's staining that very bright red color. And remember, we said acetophils are going to be the ones that have to do with growth. So that's going to be growth hormone and your prolactin, not luteinizing hormone. Okay, luteinizing hormone is going to be made by your basophils. See, this is pointing to a basophil. It's saying ACTH. Remember, that's the hormone that stimulates the adrenal cortex. And the basophils are the ones that kind of control your other endocrine glands. So C is going to be correct. It's the only one that matches. Okay, this one, the pituitary gland has significant effect on regulation of hormone secretions in which of the following organs? So it does affect the testes. Remember, that's through that follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. The pituitary gland does the same thing on the ovaries with the same hormones. The adrenal medulla, and that's the key there. Remember, we didn't talk about the pituitary gland controlling the adrenal medulla. That's where we're making our epinephrine, our fight or flight. response. It controls the adrenal cortex. So that one is incorrect. The answer would just be A and B. This one, which of these structures does not match? So A is pointing to this topmost layer. And remember we said that would be the ganglion layer. That's the layer that forms the optic nerve. So this is the ganglion layer, so that does not match. B, we're pointing to these cells, right, that are connecting two different layers. They have two little ends in the nuclei in the middle. Those are our bipolar cells. Okay, so these are actually switched, right? And then C, the choroid plexus. Remember we said the choroid layer is that vascular layer with all those blood vessels, so that does match. So the answer would just be A and B because we're talking about the ones that do not match, right? And C does match. Okay, which muscle type does not match? Again, it's their image. So A, this is pointing to the ciliary muscle, right, of the ciliary body. So we've got the ciliary processes here, ciliary muscle, and remember we said that attaches to the zonules to change the shape of the lens. And so it's saying that's skeletal muscle, and that is incorrect, right? I cannot consciously or voluntarily choose to change the shape of my lens. That's kind of an automatic thing that happens. So that's incorrect. That does not match. B is pointing to this muscle right here. And remember we said that's the dilator muscle. And the dilator muscle is not made of smooth muscle. It's made of that myoepithelium. So that one does match. C, we're pointing to this one. So remember this is that constrictor muscle. And that is made of smooth muscle. Okay, so the only one that doesn't match is going to be A, the skeletal muscle. Alrighty, so that's the end of that. Hopefully that was helpful for you guys, and good luck on your quiz.